بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله يا ربنا زدنا علما وتقوى ويغفر لنا قصورنا وذنوبنا ونقصاننا وأنت قادر على هذا فنتوجه إليك بالتوبة نستغفرك ونتوب إليك والعصر إن الإنسان في خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. We wanted to focus on an important reorientation note. And that reorientation note has everything to do with the way that we deal with knowledge. We have to realize that many of us have a fissure, a gap, a dividing point, even we may say a wall between us and the path of knowledge. Especially as that path of knowledge was undertaken by the scholars of Islam. And the reality that we confront is a reality of deficiency and a reality of arrested development when it comes to how it is that we deal with knowledge. Firstly, the modern conception of knowledge is a way to deal with knowledge in brief, without much depth, and there's an idea of thinking that you can grasp knowledge by telling a story about it. And that's why there's a lot of focus on the history of ideas. And then you speculate on those ideas that come to you in a story. And that's not the way that Islamic knowledge operates. We don't observe from a distance what's going on yonder. We tell a story about it and we speculate as to what are the causes and why that what we see at a distance is taking place and what are the underlying rules or rationale for why that's taking place the way that it is that we see. There is an experience component to knowledge in Islam, and there is the reality that the Islamic framework incorporates the whole of the human being. It's not just an intellectual process. It's not just a spiritual experience. It's not just a value put into action. Knowledge in Islam addresses the reality of life as a whole. That point aside. Another important point, aside from the fact that we have to become conscious of the way that modern culture forces us to understand knowledge, is the reality that the Muslims were people that had a relationship with the Quran that was consistent. And that relationship with the Quran was a relationship that had to do with frequency and had to do with accuracy. Frequency of recitation and accuracy of recitation. And then came the issue of understanding and practice. That was foundational even in the early generation. The earliest generation, the Quranic generation of revelation, the generation of the companions or the disciples, radiallahu anhum ajmain, of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, they, for the most part, didn't experience the whole of the Quran being revealed to them at one time. It came with graduality, and neither did they experience the Quran the way that we experience the Quran, from the angle of the fact that we have a mushaf in hand and we approach it as a whole. We approach it as a whole, as though it's given to us as a whole, when in fact it was given to us gradually. And so their approach to the Quran was definitely superior with regard to implementing the Quran in life. And what we get is their efforts of preserving the Quran, but what begins to happen is that in today's time, in the modern world, unlike a few hundred years ago, what happens with the Quran is that it becomes a book that goes on a shelf and is shelved away. And alhamdulillah, that at least in the Muslim world and in some places in the West, that's not the case. The Quran, although it's in the Mus'haf form, it's in the printed form that we have today that's easily accessible. People have a relationship with reading it with frequency and reciting it with accuracy. But what happens in many of our institutions is that when it comes to the issue of understanding and looking to see how to implement, now things become cloudy. And so we have a lot of questions and so on and so forth. And what we're doing is we're referring many times to what was said in the past, which is not necessarily bad, but we don't have the cultural background of Islamic knowledge. And that brings us to a third point. So this second point was demonstrating the issue that the Quran came gradually and it was implemented. It was understood and implemented. And there was a frequency point, and it has to do with the Quran being constantly on the minds and on the tongues. And what we mean by the mind is a point of reflection, intellectually a point of reflection, and in the heart deeper, right? A point of bridging the person with Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. And so the Quran was recited frequently and accurately, and it was understood and practiced in that early generation. And then when the Mus'haf becomes codified, still there is this frequent recitation of the Quran, right? And there is this accurate recitation of Quran. There's this understanding of the Quran that's taking place, and there's this implementation. And somewhere in the modern world, especially with many of us in these later generations in today's time, there's a definite distance between us and the Quran. And recitation and accuracy of recitation and understanding it, and definitely in implementing it. And so what happens is that we're going to go to this other point, that fissure, that gap between us and the Quran, and being in an environment that's imbued by Quranic values and the centrality of the Quran. What happens is that when we go into what we call Islamic studies, and more specific in Aqidah studies, we are not coming to Aqidah studies with that backdrop of frequent relationship with the Quran, so that the Quran is primary. Well, there's a statement that's attributed to Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, which is important, rahmatullahi alayhi. And that statement that's attributed to him had everything to do with the issue of the codification, or the writing in Aqidah, actually, before we say codification, the writing in Aqidah and fiqh and so on and so forth. And what we gather from the principle is that Imam Ahmad rejected the codification of some sort of madhab and the writing of his fatwa, right? And so the writing of his fatwa would eventually be the whole issue of that his ideas would be systematized, and then they would be organized, and that's where you get the issue of codification. That's where you get the issue of the madhab. He himself was against that, from what we hear in history. And if we notice, Imam Ahmad wrote very little, or what is attributed to him is little in Aqidah. And that there's a wisdom behind that, and that is because of the centrality of the Quran and the Sunnah, and the frequent relationship, the frequency of resorting or referring to the Quran and the Ahadith, and eventually, other knowledge that encompasses the knowledge of Hadith, which gives us the knowledge of the Sunnah. And so that frequent of reference, of recital, of memorization, of familiarity, of being able to determine accuracy, it gave a backdrop which gives us a different psychology of knowledge. So that, for instance, when the book Usul al-Sunnah is attributed to him, he's commenting on a few issues. That's why Usul al-Sunnah is a very terse text. It's attributed to him. He's commenting on a few issues that need to be clarified, but the foundation of knowledge is the book and the Sunnah. And of course, the principles of understanding the book and the Sunnah are there. And so what happens is that and this brings us to another principle, and I'm closing with this. What happens is that because we don't have that frequency of relationship and that background, and we have this gap between us and that time period, what happens is that we don't have the foundation in place. So when we go to Islamic knowledge, we're going basically illiterate. When we go into Islamic textbooks on Islamic knowledge, whatever science or discipline it is, we're going without that background. And so what happens is that we put these textbooks, and we're really distant from the primary sources of Islam. And so versus understanding these textbooks as being a commentary on issues that are taking place that need to be clarified in a particular contextual period of history or a certain set of circumstances that we can benefit from them, we take those texts to be the sacred knowledge, and revelation is turned into a referential work that's put on a shelf, and we lack familiarity. So we have to become familiar. That's why the idea of wird, or the idea of a consistent reading, a portion of reading Quran and the Sunnah with frequency on a regular basis, just becoming familiar, especially the Quran. But that's not to say a hadith is dismissed. But that frequency, because remember that the Quran gives that foundation for all other knowledge. So then the ahadith are understood in relation to the Quran. That's another issue that happens, is that we begin to become familiar with a lot of hadith, and sometimes they appear to contradict each other, or sometimes you get different meanings, or there's reasons why there's different teaching, and then we don't know the reality of how they relate to the Quran, or we don't have that Quranic background, and that creates also an issue for us in understanding the hadith. And so with those notes, we end people, and we ask Allah in the short period of time that we live to be able to have that experience of knowledge that will allow us to revive the deen, to revive our lives, and to give us a solid understanding. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.